One day, when I was at market while living in Ethiopia, I had a feeling that I should buy coffee for my neighbor and friend Gemba. Her husband had lost his job, and in Ethiopia, there is no government or employer assistance. Friends, family, and neighbors help each other. Most families roast their own coffee and drink it with sugar and milk. I bought a kilo of raw coffee, or green coffee beans, and a kilo of sugar. 1 kilo is equal to 2 pounds, 2 ounces. On the way home, I stopped in a small shop to buy milk for ourselves. As I walked home down the dirt and stone path and turned the corner to go up to our house, Gemba was standing outside our house. Walking over to Gemba, I said, "Look what I have for you." Her response was, "You talk to God too?" For just the evening before, she had prayed for coffee. Finding out she was also out of milk, I gave her our milk also. I could sense God's presence was with us, and I was again reminded to pay attention to those deep inner nudges. The scripture today is found in Luke 12:13-21, the parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God."
Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you here. I'm happy to be worshiping with you this morning, and I'd like to share just in brief a little bit about last week. Some of you may have noticed that I got a little bit emotional down here during the song right before I preached, which meant that I was kind of sniffling and crying and whatnot during the sermon. And there was a bit of concern, firstly by my wife, who came over and said, what's going on? Are you okay? Other persons throughout the week have sent me emails or called or personally come by and said, are you okay? Is everything okay? Just want to assure you that everything is okay with me, and also it was okay with me. During the song, which was a song, if you weren't here, that was just singing about doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly before the Lord. As I sang that, just a real sense of God's grace and mercy and love came over me. And I started crying, and I was wondering, okay, well, what's going on here? And God said, well, I'm just doing something, so go with it. And I did, and it ended up that I was bawling like a baby, basically. Kind of uncontrollably once I said yes to God. And it was a good thing. It was a very good thing. As I went out the door then after the service, I actually talked to Becky Hess, who had this Cheshire cat grin on her mouth, and shook my hand. And she said, when we were practicing that song on Wednesday, I told the worship team that the only appropriate response to this song is weeping. So, there you have it. It was a God thing, and for me. And so I just wanted to share that everything is fine and good, and God is with me. Today we're turning and we're continuing this series that we're thinking about money, how we use our money that God has given us, and what's a faithful way of doing that. And so the series title is called Testing the Ladder of Success. And what you may have noticed is that we have a ladder up here, and we're going down. I'm not sure if you noticed on the posters, but the guy isn't walking up, the guy is walking down. And so we're testing this idea of what the world says successful life is and what God says the successful life is. And in the kingdom of heaven, that is an upside down kingdom. And we are actually to try to walk down and to walk humbly before the Lord, right? And to love mercy and to do justice. And so we first started thinking about contentment, and then we started thinking last week about loving, which I really got a cup full of that. And then today we're talking about sharing, okay? And that's what Jesus is talking about here in this Luke 12 passage. The setting is something like this. It says that there were thousands of people. The crowd was thousands. And actually the word that is translated thousands means a multitude, like a bunch, like more people than they could count. So there's this group of a whole bunch of people, probably men and women, gathered around Jesus, okay? And it says that they were trampling on one another. There were so many people, they were trampling on one another. Actually, probably a more, and I know I do this, and I say there's a better translation. I do some reading in Greek, and I'm not a Greek scholar, but I kind of read the Greek, and George might be better at this than I am. But what I read was that it can be trampling, but it also means frustrated or insulting. So you might have been in places where there's just so many people and they're all around you and you just get frustrated. You just get irritated. So that's the kind of setting. I mean, there's this whole bunch of people and they're gathered and they want to hear Jesus' teaching because they think he's got something good to say, but there's just a lot of people trying to get to him and trying to talk to him. And so there's this sense of agitation. And they're all trying to get something from Jesus. They want something from him, and they come kind of having an idea of what they want from him. So he's talking and he's having this conversation, and so this one guy butts into the conversation, speaks from the crowd, and he says, "Hey, listen, tell my brother to share some of the inheritance with me." Okay? Tell my brother to share some of the inheritance with me. So I've got this idea of that if he's saying that, and if he's expecting Jesus to respond, then I think it would be a good assumption to think that Jesus' brother's there with him. Right? Okay? So the two brothers are there. I wanted to be able to say maybe it's Peter and Andrew. Right? Because Peter and Andrew are his two disciples, and Peter and Andrew, they kind of had a pretty good business. It seems like Peter's kind of the big brother, and so in that setting, he would have gotten the inheritance. The oldest person in the family gets the inheritance. So I wanted to be able to say, so maybe it's Peter and Andrew. But I can't say that, because it says that there's someone from the crowd. Okay? So it's not the disciples that are saying this, even though they always got things wrong, and were confused, and they wanted Jesus to do what they wanted Jesus to do, but it's from the crowd. So some of this frustrated crowd is butting in. They're close enough to be able to say something to Jesus, and they say, these two brothers, I'm thinking maybe like Matt and Jonathan Landis. Right? Or maybe it's John, or Jack Hess and Kim, I don't know, maybe. Having some conversation about the family inheritance. What's going to happen? He's got more than I got. So he comes and he says, these two brothers, we don't really know exactly who they are, but that's kind of the setting. They say, Jesus, make him share. I mean, he's got all of everything. And really, some of what that he's got, right, I kind of helped because I've been part of the family business. I've been working on the family farm. I've been working with the Nets. And so some of this inheritance I actually built. So how is it fair that he gets it all and I don't get anything? So of course, right, Jesus is going to say, what? Buddy, you're right. Absolutely, man. You ought to share. Brother, share with your brother. Of course Jesus would say that, right? He's fair. He's a good king. He's a fair judge. That's what they do, right? And instead, what does he say? Stop being so greedy. To the guy that had nothing, right? Stop being so greedy. And then, to help everybody understand why he's saying what he's saying to this brother who doesn't have anything, supposedly, he tells a story. He tells a story. So, now that we sort of have a little idea of what the context is and what's going on and who Jesus is talking to, let's read the story again. Let's read the story about the story that Jesus tells here. He said to this guy, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between the two of you? And then he said, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. You know what, a man's life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possessions. And then he told him this story. He said, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I don't have a place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I'll build a bigger one. And there I will store all of my grain and all of my goods. And I'll say to myself, you got plenty of stuff laid up for many years. I'm going to take life easy. I'm going to eat and I'm going to drink and I'm going to have a good time. That's, a paraphrase, of course. But God said to him, God the Father, that's what Jesus is saying. God the Father, my Father, said to him, you fool. It's not Jesus saying it, it's God the Father saying, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? The idea is, well, all the stuff that you stored up for yourself, that you've been hoarding for yourself, that you've been, keeping to you, where's it going to go? To all the people that, of course, you've been keeping it from, right? That's where it's going to go. And this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God the Father. Now, this story reminds me of two stories in the Bible, and I think it probably would have reminded the people there of two stories. The first story would have been the story in 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, and that's the story of Solomon and the two prostitutes. Okay? In that story, Solomon has asked for wisdom, and God has given him wisdom as this wise king. And so these two prostitutes, they both have kids. If you don't remember the story, one rolls over on one of their kids, smothers the kid, steals the other prostitute's child, and then says it's theirs. And there's nobody to arbitrate. There's no one to say, well, that was her baby and it's not yours. And so they go before Solomon in order to figure things out, because he's the king and he's going to judge. And so they have this little conversation. Solomon's really smart. He says, well, cut the baby in half. Give half to one and half to the other. Okay? Now you can do that with property. You can do that with farms. Not a good idea with babies. With human beings, you don't want to divide human beings up like that. That's not very nice. And so, the one says, great, do it. And the real mother says, no, wait. You just give the baby away. And so Solomon, really smart, says, well, of course the ones that's saying give it away is the real one, and the ones that's saying cut it in half so nobody has one isn't the real mother. And so he judges. And so there's this wonderful judge who's so wise that he's able to arbitrate everything that happens in the kingdom, everything that happens in the world. Okay? That's the first story that this reminds me of. The second story that it reminds me of is a story in Genesis chapter 41 and 47 primarily, but really that whole kind of story where Joseph is the second in command of Egypt. Remember that story? And he gets sold into slavery, but then he becomes like this huge, powerful person in the kingdom, and he has this dream, and he knows that there's going to be a famine in the land, and so, great idea. What we're going to do is we're going to build big barns, huge storehouses, right? And we're going to take all of this these 7 years of abundant grain, and we're going to put it all in barns, right? Store it up so that when there's a famine, when there's lack, so first abundance, so when there's lack, well then everybody can live. We can eat, and we can drink, and we can be merry, right? So it reminds me of that story. Only problem with that story is that as soon as Joseph's gone and everybody sort of forgets about Joseph and the Pharaoh and that part of the story, and that this whole storing up of abundance was somehow to provide for the people of Israel, they actually end up in slavery for 400 years. Again, not a really good thing. And so Pharaoh has these people in slavery. And what happens in the land of Egypt is the people of Israel really, for 400 years, when a people is in slavery for that many years and experiences that much oppression and that much lack, right? And that much lack of abundance, that really does something bad and harsh to a people. There's a lot of pain there. And even when they leave Egypt and they're freed and they go through the desert and then they come into the promised land, which is a land filled with milk and honey and abundance, and they're supposed to see that, they don't see it. They don't notice it. And the reason that they don't notice it is because they've been so trained to see the world through being prostitutes and through being slaves, that even if there's abundance that God's providing around them, they live as if they're still prostitutes or like they're still slaves. And so Jesus comes. Jesus comes to this kind of people who don't see that God's not going to provide. That's not the message here. The message isn't that God's going to provide. The message is God has provided. Everything that you need, you already have. Don't you see that? Look at the birds flying around. Not that God's going to provide. God has provided. And so what Jesus is trying to do is to help us understand, firstly, something very important about himself. And that is that he's not going to be the kind of Messiah that is this judge that arbitrates between us and makes all of these decisions for us. Because if we see Jesus and we relate to Jesus as a judge, right, then we will always be criminals. And we will always be prostitutes. Or if we're on the other side, we will always use that in some sort of oppressive way. If we see Jesus as a judge, because Jesus is for us. And he's going to, of course, say, do this or do that. Jesus doesn't want to be that kind of Messiah, right? And he also doesn't want to be the sort of huge kingly Pharaoh kind of Egypt Messiah, right? Either. Why? Well, because if that's the kind of Messiah he is, and if that's how he's going to relate to us, then we're going to always be slaves. Or we're going to be aligned to the right political system, to the right king, and to the right Pharaoh, and we're going to use that relationship to keep ourselves powerful. So Jesus comes and he says, you know what? I'm not doing either of those. Who appointed me as judge? Who appointed me as king between you? Let me tell you a story. And let me give you some understanding of who God is and who I am in this situation. And then I'm going to just let you do the right thing in these situations. That's what Jesus is trying to help us to understand. That he is this new kind of Messiah. And that he is coming with a mindset of a narrative of abundance, which is what Brueggemann calls it, as opposed to a narrative of scarcity. And I can't really go into all of that, but basically what it means is we see the world through the eyes that God has already provided enough now. And if we see that, then we can share. If we see it through the eyes of the prostitute or the slave, we will never, ever, ever be able to move to a sense of abundance and gratitude and generosity. And we could talk about that. It takes a little bit to sort of think through that. One way to think about it is just simply on our own history. Does anyone remember the Depression here? Okay, I'm hearing some murmurings, right? Some of us lived through the Depression, right? You remember that? And because of that real narrative of scarcity, even now, there's some anxiety from that, right? Even now, some of you might even save a tea bag so you could use it again. Even though you've got like 12 boxes and 6 different flavors in the cabinet. Am I wrong? I mean, I'm not making we're laughing about it, but it's kind of funny when you talk about it here. But see, that's what that kind of stuff does to us. And then when we live our faith out that way, that creates some problems. And when we use Jesus either as our own personal judge or our own personal king, well, that creates problems as well. Now, there might be some arguments to this. You can't be too generous. We won't have enough. We do have to consider retirement, of course. We can't just go about just giving everything away. And that's true, certainly. Of course that's true. We actually have 2 people in our church right now who are in one of the elderly care facilities. I won't tell you which. But they've run out of money. Did you know that? 2 of our members of our church are living in an elderly care facility, and they've run out of money, right? And so one of the things that we're doing is with this Thanksgiving fund giving, that money's going to help those two people. Not all of it, of course, but some of it. And just to I'm going to step out here, and I know that there might be some anxiety about where this money goes. We don't really report on it. One of the reasons is because we're trying to protect people's confidentiality, but there is some concern, about what's this money being used for? Where's it going? Is it being misappropriated in some way to pay for the lights or staff salary or something like that? Let me assure you that all of the money that's given here goes to help people in this congregation who can't pay their light bills, can't pay their food bills, and can't afford to stay in places like Landis Homes and Tell High and Garden Spot. So I just want to ease that concern. That money is going to those kinds of things. Okay? So just a little tangent there. But that is an act of abundance by giving, right? It's an act of saying, you know what? We have enough, and so we're going to share. So there are ways that this can happen. We can be generous, and we can be taken care of in retirement if we understand abundance as a community thing and not just a personal thing. The other argument would be that there's bad people in the world. Some people abuse the system. And of course, that's true too, Sure, yeah. But do we really want to use that as a way to justify being greedy? I mean, and when you're being greedy. When you're just making an excuse for that kind of thing. So of course it happens, but there are ways that we can work at making sure that as we give and as we are generous and as we live out of a sense of abundance that God has provided already, there's ways to do that in responsible ways. Love Inc. is one way, and we're connected to them, and there's certainly other ways that we work at that. But really, those are all just good arguments, but there are also good answers that Jesus gives, and it's kind of a hard answer, really. And it's the consistent answer that he gives throughout his entire ministry and really throughout the scriptures. And that's simply, you need to die to yourself, right? And you need to pick up your cross every day and work it out. Take my principles that I'm giving you and try to figure it out in this very complex world that's changing. Die to yourself. Pick up your cross. And in this situation, don't be greedy. Stop being so greedy because God has provided for you already. So I'd like to give you a few practical things that you can do that might help with this. I think the first one's pretty important, and then kind of the rest sort of follow along. They're creative ideas. You don't have to take them. They're not like you should do this. They're just some things that I came up with. But the first is pretty important. The first thing we need to do is we need to start by noticing where there is abundance already in our lives. And for some of you, for some of us, this may be very difficult because of hurt, because of your past, what things have happened to you, or because of where you are spiritually. We really need Jesus Christ to be able to do this. We need the infilling of the Holy Spirit and the empowerment of God. And I want to pray for that here in a little bit. But that's what's important in order for us to do that, to get a sense and to begin to notice the abundance in our life. And one way to do that, and I think the best way, is to get a spiritual director, right? I'm always talking about getting a spiritual director and having conversation with that. A spiritual director can help us to notice the abundance of the presence of God in our lives. And then as you begin to notice that more of what God has already provided in our life, then we can become more grateful. And then it's much easier to be generous and to begin to share. That experience changes how we see our world and how we behave in it. Now, that can take some time, but once you are in that place, and I believe some of you are in that place, you can begin to think in creative ways about how you're going to live out of a narrative of abundance. So one good place to start, in my opinion, is all that stuff in your basement and in your attic, right? I mean, I know I have a lot of stuff in my basement and attic, and you can begin to give that away, right? You can start giving that away. And I want to say, don't worry, really, don't worry, because almost as soon as you give it all away, it'll come back. Have you ever noticed that? I can't tell you how many housefuls of stuff I've given away in my lifetime. I know it's 3 almost full houseloads of stuff, and I still have all the stuff in my basement. It's exactly what our Malachi passage says. You know, give. Take that stuff into the storehouse of the temple of God, which for us is the world. It's where we give things. Test me on this. Watch. All that stuff you've given away in your basement and your attic and you thought it was going to be clean for like a couple years, you watch. It's just going to fill up with more blessing, and then you can just give that away. And if you keep doing that, it will keep filling up. Now, I don't particularly like that my attic and basement fills up, but, you know, you get the point. The rest of your abundance is in your bank accounts or in whatever barns you have built along the way. And you might begin to look there about what abundance might be there that you could freely and gratefully share with others. I think this might be something we should think about as well as a church. Did you notice there was a hurricane? We were very fortunate, were we not? I hope that we were fortunate. If you need help with your house or downed trees, I'd like to just thank the trustees. Did you know that we lost 2 trees here? You aware of that? Most of you were. Some trustees came by, cut them all up, you know, turned them into a house somewhere, I think. Not really, but they're gone. You're not that gullible, of course. So thank you for them and for what they did. But there might be other ways that as a church we could think about how we could share some of our abundance with some of the needs. And maybe one of you wants to take that on and sort of organize that. And if you do, please feel free to do that. There's some other things that you might do, and I'll just go through these fairly quickly because I know we're talking a while. But I do think it's important that we discuss these things. Some of you are really good at making money. Really, really good at making a whole lot of money. And I want to say that I believe that that is a gift from God. And I want to encourage you to live into your gift. Of course, in responsible, just ways. But live into your gift. I would really appreciate it if you would make a huge amount of money. Really, because I believe it's a gift of God. And then I would like to encourage you to be generous with it. Because as you make money, you're providing health care, you're providing clothing, you're providing education for all of your employees. And so God bless you for that. And then you don't have to just give it away. Go spend it. Go spend it. Go out and eat at a restaurant as often as you can. Right? Don't put it in your bank. And when that waitress or waiter comes and feeds you and serves you in that way, don't be skimpy. Don't give 10%, 15%. I'm guilty of that too. I'm like, wasn't very good service. 1% off for this and 2% off for that. Didn't bring my water. I know I'm going long, but this is important stuff. If you've got it, share it, give it. Give them 50%. Give them 100% of the tab. Or pay for somebody that's next to you and bless them. You don't have to just give it away. I mean, one of the people here was really bent out of shape. I've told this story before. They were redoing their backyard. They were spending money redoing their backyard. How selfish is that? Putting down pavers when there's people suffering. And they were kind of bent out of shape about it. And I said, you know what? I think you're doing a good thing. You're employing 6 people who have 6 families and 14, 20, however many children. And because you're redoing your backyard and spending all that money, $27 on a paver, you're helping a lot of people. So don't just put it in the bank. Spend it. That's what it's for. And if you have even extra, give it. Give it generously. And the promise of God is that when you do that, it's going to come back to you. The promise of God is you can't outgive God. The message of the story is, if we live into the teachings of Jesus, God is going to bless. So stop being greedy. Recognize that you already have everything you need to do everything that God is calling you to do. It will always, always be enough.